I've had the pleasure of having these folks in our lab, and we're going to start by in the order in which they've been in the lab. Jennifer is to my left is the most recent artist in residence. She's been there for a few weeks, but Lucas started it off, and so I'm going to turn to each of them, and to start with, they're going to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about their practice, and why would they want to be in a neuroscience lab. Lucas.
Is the same one? Yeah, okay. We were talking about how the microphones work. So my name is Lucas Kelly. I'm an artist, a curator, professor of visual art, and the Dean of Arts and Communication at Mercer County Community College. So my practice has evolved quite a bit over the years, but one sort of sustaining thing that has always been in my practice is memory. Back a number of years ago, my father passed away, and I decided to stop making art altogether for a year as a way of sort of not making dead dad work and kind of having like a cleansing moment. What I ended up doing was starting a project where I was really invested in our need for linear narrative and memory, and how those things kind of break down pretty easily. And we fabricate things that we don't remember just to maintain that linear narrative. So that started kind of making a positive thing, not a positive thing out of my dad's death, but approaching it from a positive place and interacting with our relationship for a number of years. And of course, that expanded into other areas of looking at not only my personal realm, but also socio-political memory, kind of the memory of architecture and the differences of how we all engage with architecture and have different feelings about those buildings. So anyway, so I'm in Philadelphia. I have a studio not too far from where Matt's mural arts project is, and I'm talking a good game about how the brain processes memory to a bunch of artists. And I think to myself, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. And since everything is anecdotal, I decide maybe I should just throw out to an artist collective that I was part of called Tiger Strikes Asteroid. Maybe I should ask them, hey, does anybody know a neuroscientist that I could talk to just to, double check what I'm doing? And somebody said, oh yeah, it's like classic Philadelphia thing. Yeah, I know a guy, my neighbor, and so I get in touch with the guy, and the guy is like, no, you want to talk to this other guy, Anjan Chatterjee. And so without knowing who Anjan is at all, I just sent an email to this guy and hey, I'm interested in learning more about this. And he said, I'm interested in learning more about artists and potentially having an artist in residence come to the lab and figure it out. After I sent that email is when I actually Googled him. I probably would not have sent the email had I Googled him prior. But I was really happy to find out that Anjan is a very personable, very I would call us friends. A really warm soul to be with, and obviously very interesting, but also very nurturing of knowledge and exploration. And so we sat down at a table in his office, and he said, I don't want anybody who's just going to draw the brain. And I said, I don't draw brains. I don't want to draw brain scans. I don't want to do anything like that. And we basically agreed on this idea that like neither one of us was interested in illustrating the science, right? That I wanted my approach. He wanted me to sort of be a disruptor in the lab. And you know, I think we had a pretty good time. And then COVID happened. And that actually completely shifted our residency. Maybe we'll talk about that.
Yeah, let's hold off on that because
Yeah.
that's an important piece to come
Yeah.
out.
So, yeah, why don't I let Judith talk?
Is this thing on? Okay, I can't tell from here. I'm Judith Schaechter and I make stained glass windows. I was for many years an adjunct professor of anything. I was at University of the Arts, Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and I ended up at Tyler School of Art at Temple University. I first, I guess, I don't know exactly how to explain my interest. I feel like I always have to take such a deep ancient dive. My father was a microbiologist and my mother was a social worker, and she read lots of books about brains and they were all over our house and I read them too. And ultimately I read The Aesthetic Brain by Anjan, and I was so excited. And then after COVID, there was a walkthrough at this, what I think it's called the Museum for Art and Wood. I can't keep track of its names. And Anjan was doing a walkthrough, and I found out somehow that they had an artist in residence. And I was, I can't really put words to it. It was very intuitive. But my excitement about somehow becoming the artist in residence was so acute. Like at some point I was like, this is it. This is my whole bucket list. I I really, really, really want to do this. And one solid reason I can cite is that my experience as an art student and then later a adjunct professor of art was that talking about beauty was basically verboten. And I mean, that there's a million reasons for it. I can't even say it's strange. I mean, I'd love to say, isn't that weird? But what I really think is, isn't that typical? And so I found the people who wanted to talk about it, and talk we did. So that's about it.
This thing on? Okay, good. Hi, my name is Jennifer Joseph. I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I make large sculptural installations. I started out as a painter. I went to Moore College of Art and Design. I spent the most of my career in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And, I didn't really have any academic positions. I mostly spent my time working stupid day jobs and saving my brain power for my work. So, I'd come home from work and spend time in the studio. And, my whole philosophy around making art is, there's enough ugly stuff in this world. And if you're going to have the privilege of making art, it better be pretty. And, it better be pretty because it has to give something back. So my whole thing is to make something as aesthetic and as beautiful as possible. So I have gone against that whole overarching tendency in academia and our world. And I think, beauty is a very nourishing thing. So the reason why I got involved and reached out to Anjan, a friend of mine who is a curator, I had reached out to her for the 90th time. Like, can you write a recommendation for me for this grant? Okay, so I had sent her an essay with all of my, thinking, which is to make the most beautiful art as possible and to make the most healing art possible. And she said, you should reach out to Anjan Chatterjee. So I did, not knowing, like you. And so I was living in Susquehanna County at the time. So it wasn't going to be possible for me to make the weekly meetings. But when I moved to Philadelphia in the last 2 months, which is where I'm originally from, I reached out again. And so John said, as it so happens, we have an opening. So here we are.
Yeah, timing is everything. So one of the things we've tried to do, and I wonder if each of you could comment, Jennifer, you're just at the beginning of this, but wanting to have people be in lab meetings in the way that we have weekly lab meetings, but more than that, to just be embedded in just the culture of the lab. And I wonder if you guys can at least comment on what that experience was like, or and what you would hope it becomes. So.
Judith decided I'm going first. So I think, to quote Judith from a recent conversation, that was the best part. The culture in Anjan's lab is really supportive. And we always in academia talk about imposter syndrome, right? So imagine being an artist, walking into a scientist's lab. I fully expected white lab coats. Kind of in my head, the scene from Clockwork Orange where they have the eyes open, that's sort of what I thought he did. And so I was very nervous going into that first meeting. And just the general warmth of everybody in the room took that kind of austerity away and that fear away. And then those relationships really helped the work that we ended up doing kind of navigate in different ways. We had a conversation once walking along Delaware during COVID, and I mentioned to Anjan, my imposter syndrome was really, really heavy, and he was like, "Yeah, but you're a smart guy," and I was, and I think that is not what I had expected from the entire lab the entire time I was there. Was the amount of respect and openness to allowing an artist just kind of be there and participate. I every time a paper popped up, I was like, all right, I got to read this whole thing by the next lab meeting. And it's like reading all this stuff and trying to figure it out. And it's like I'm dropped in the middle of this high level science project that is completely foreign language, but I just was so invested in it. And then the conversations were like very normal, very understandable. And when I didn't understand something, they were like, "Here, let me explain it to you," and then ask me questions. So, what do you think about that? How does that work for you? And so, being engaged in the lab, not just as somebody who just kind of sat there and was like, I'm an artist. But actually, having discussions and working through things together was really meaningful.
I think I also had no idea what to expect, and the social aspect was fantastic. It was really interesting and really fun. There were just what I had hoped for. It was like an intellectual salon where people were batting ideas around. The actual lab meeting, there was a lot of it seemed very granular to me. Like I was interested in the big questions, like, isn't beauty great? Let's figure it out, And the studies that people were doing, the individual projects were like very, very specific and very, very interesting, but it wasn't like dealing with big questions. So there was sort of two ways of going about thinking about things, and they were both attended to. And also I ended up making friends with, people at the lab, and we went apps throwing. So there's that. I wanted to say something that I meant to say earlier about the drawing a brain. You've heard it so many times, you're so tired of it. So Anjan said, don't draw a brain. And that made me want to draw a brain really badly. Really very, very badly. But not because just to spite Anjan, but because
which is certainly possible.
Well, that's part of it. But I think that I wanted to show that everything an artist does is an illustration of a brain. Better than a CAT scan. Just look at the pictures artists do, or non-artists. Pictures anyone does. That's a picture of a brain right there. That's it.
That's a good point. I have no idea what to expect, but I'm excited because most of my interest artistically involves trying to elucidate and translate patterns that aren't visible or aren't sensed. So people who do research on brains are interesting to me because I like to understand, what are those microstructures? What are they doing? How do they look when they do the things that they do? A lot of my work involves repetition. And so I find cellular structure very interesting. I'm not interested in drawing pictures of brains, but I'm actually making a big brain right now. So, out of ancient healing materials.
Not as part of the residency, I want to be clear.
It's not part of the residency, but it was something I've already been working on for the last several months. But what I hope to get out of it is, again, relationships with smart people. That's always a wonderful thing. And then, the other thing is to sort of understand, our perception of not only just beauty, but just how the brain works in terms of, how we, I don't know where I'm going with this. It's more about, just understanding how we see, how we perceive color. Color to me is a very nourishing aspect of making art. I started out as a painting. I love color. So, I'm interested in understanding like how those things actually work and why they make us feel a certain way.
So one of the things that I mentioned in the earlier talk was not having a preconceived notion where things would end up, except for the fact that I did want something to end up, right? Which I think Judith was unhappy at first when she heard there needed to be.
Very.
Um,
Just wanted to sit there.
but in at least in both Lucas's case and Judith's case, what I observed was where they started isn't where they ended. And I mean, you came in with a very explicit interest in memory, as you've talked about. But your project, which again, because of lockdown and COVID, I mean, it was scheduled for the Esther Klein Gallery, but it never happened. But where you went ended up not being directly about memory. And Judith, you initially thought, we do a lot of work on facial appearance and the way in which we find that aesthetic and moral values get conflated in how people look. And one line of our work is not directly about art, but is the way in which when people have facial anomalies, scars, burns, and so on, that other people who have or typical faces tend to have implicit biases against such people, that they're less intelligent, less smart, less trustworthy, and so on. And there was a way in which you started with that, with some of your glass works, but where you ended up was very different than that. So I've never asked either of you this, what happened that the thing that motivated you to come in ended up taking a turn in a different direction.
Ira Glass said on some interview about This American Life that every single story on This American Life ever could be described as, I started out to do this one thing and then something else happened. I was sort of terrified
He's a glass artist.
He's a glass artist. I just wanted to sit and listen and doodle. I knew from the outset that there would be a project, And I knew also that I would generate mass quantities of material if I could doodle during the meeting. So I just started out with that. And some like this one right here is an example based on those doodles, which are when I'm doodling, I'm doing the ought test, right? How many different flies can I invent before I can't think of any more flies? And my I don't know, I can't remember if this is my hypothesis or the other thing, but I'm thinking that it's infinity. And it's not, there's like that thing about the amount that comes later is better. I would say it's more of an arch. Like the ones at the beginning are kind of like the boring old default ideas, and then you start getting creative, really creative, and then you get tired, and then they get bad again. So anyway, so that was some of my thinking. As for the ultimate project that I did, it was a combination of thinking of what would be inspiring to me that would make sense in this context, and a lot of the research that the postdocs and the students were doing was into biophilic spaces, and I I was sort of loosely connecting that in my head to the inspiration I was getting from old natural history prints, and thinking that was my first thinking that like, oh, this science illustration, it looks more like art. It doesn't look like science. And and that I can tell because I know what artists think like. They're taking liberties. They're playing little games when you're not aware. And they're getting away with stuff. And so I just was interested in using that as inspiration to create an architectural space. As a stained glass artist, stained glass is supposed to be an architecture, but I always have worked with autonomous panels that are exhibited like paintings in a gallery. So I took this opportunity to build a little church. Also, my father, the scientist, was like a hardcore materialist. And I had this preconceived notion that all scientists were this way. And I couldn't wait to make some spiritual architecture to stick it to science. But turned out they were really open-minded.
So I think for me, the reason that things shifted so much is because so much of my project starts off being very personal, and with all artists, I think this is the case. We make things so that they have purpose for us, right? And then we know that we have to release them into the world, and that the viewer is actually the one who is participating in the making of meaning.
Cheers to that.
So I think, I had to deviate from that really intense personal studio practice because I wanted to be collaborative with the lab. I wanted the lab to be, I wanted it to actually not really be my practice. I wanted it to be this like art team that I was on, and that we were collaborating, and I was kind of taking ideas and I was the facilitator of the imagery or the objects. That became my goal pretty quick in the lab, was to get away from the solo act and be part of the band.
So I think one thing I think it might be worth talking about this idea of the lockdown and what a traumatic time that was for, I assume, everybody in this room. And having Lucas in the lab at the time, what role he ended up playing. And this is a good example where I have to say, oh, you didn't get to answer that. Sorry. Go ahead. She hasn't done it yet.
I haven't done anything yet, but I haven't.
We'll come back to that. So,
There's some thoughts about it, though. We'll get there.
So this is an example where I was pushed out of my comfort zone and out of what I wanted to do, because in this kind of hypermanic high productivity mode that many scientists are in, it's like, okay, lockdown sucks, but it also means that nobody is traveling, nobody's going anywhere. I mean, just to give you an example, this is atypical. In the last 6 weeks, I've been in India, I've been in Germany, I've been in Florence, and all part for work. And all of a sudden it was going to be, oh, there's no travel, can't go anywhere, you can't do anything but write up that data that we've been collecting, right? So I thought, oh, what a great time that we'll do all this stuff. And Eileen Cardillo, who's in the audience, and Lucas put up resistance to this idea. And the point that they were bringing up is we can't ignore what is going on right now. And it's not business as usual. And that we need to take advantage of the fact that we are experiencing this communal trauma, and how can we take advantage of actually having an artist in the lab in this moment. And that's just to tee it up. And if you want to then tell people what happened and how that played out. Because at that point, for those set of lab meetings, so I have a very stereotypical way of running lab meetings. Lucas was the boss. And so
Anjan frequently says, you know, what is art good for? But that's the big question. And also at the time when Eileen and I were proposing this project to the lab, we were kind of also saying, like, we talk about what is art good for. We should actually maybe put it into practice here with this opportunity. And so what we designed was an aesthetic immersion project. I created a website with a series of prompts from anything from drawing projects to things that were more performative, to open-ended things that could be interpreted in a lot of different ways. And Eileen and I were like, okay, one whole week, scientists get off of sciencing and they get to immerse themselves in an aesthetic practice with the time that they would have been doing science. And they put up the auto reply. I'm out of the office. And at the end of the week, they can turn off the auto reply. They can answer their emails. But we're going to talk about this, this immersion, not necessarily as a critique like we do in art school, but more as like a seminar discussion about how it's changing the way we're looking at our science and how it's changing the way we're experiencing this, you know, this global trauma. Anjan said no. Anjan was like, what do you mean no email? This is a perfect time to do all the writing. And so there was some negotiating. We went back and forth. We got 3 days, which I thought was a win, non-consecutive.
I just want to at least offer my version of why that was. So PIs know that when you've got people in your lab, be they graduate students, undergrads, or postdocs, that people are in different points in the arc of their research into writing a paper. And that last bit where you're like a horse getting to the barn, where you're really like, you can taste the end. I didn't want that interrupted for people who are at that stage, because the activation energy to get back into that would just not be, it would just, again, not be efficient. So the idea was that we would give people a period, within a period of 3 weeks, they self-regulated when they would commit that complete time. And so that was the compromise we came to. Yeah.
And they had to answer their emails. Yeah. That was young. That auto reply thing never took off. And one of the things, actually, Eileen and I were just talking about this for about an hour and a half ago. One of the things that was really amazing is all these people who are interested in aesthetics and already had aesthetic practices in some way or another were so uncomfortable with the idea of setting aside their science, even for a few hours. So Eileen and I were like, this is going to be great. Everybody's going to do this for a week. It's going to be mind blowing. They're going to change the way they do things. And they were like, no, I've got shit to do. Like I can't just take a week off of work, you know? And so we gave everybody the 3 weeks. We came back and we just talked about the experience. We talked about what people did. Some people didn't want to share. And so they would send their evidence to us privately. Some people, and we were talking earlier about one scientist named Lee, who very reserved guy, really wonderful guy, but very reserved. And he played the Star Spangled Banner on trombone on his front porch because he was having questions about his patriotism at the time. And it was like, whoa, this came out of me. And he didn't even really fully, I mean, he was very articulate about his reasoning, but he didn't even really fully grasp the personality shift that took to do that thing. And so we talked about a lot of those emotional responses to doing these things. Yoed wouldn't do it, but
Yeah, I mean, the anecdote that Lucas was talking about is also what really struck me. And for those of you who have been in my lab, I typically get to know people the extent to which they're willing to let me into their lives. And I found out things about people in the lab that I didn't know. And it was a window into another layer of who people were. And I really think it brought us together at a time when everybody was feeling alienated and lonely.
yeah, 100%.
Yeah, go ahead.
COVID was a time when I think anyone who didn't understand what art was for hopefully figured it out. But I think it requires a liberal definition of art. A lot of people tend to think of art in a sort of elitist way. It's like what you see in a museum, and they don't include, like, I remember in art school, like they told you your work was entertainment. You were supposed to like cry and die of shame. And it's that stuff. So I think that COVID was a time when people really connected to the idea of meaning through creative practice. And yes, it is the job of the viewer.
And I mean, I think you could even extrapolate that. I mean, people were baking sourdough bread. They were making things with their hands. And yeah, so yeah, I think that was an interesting time for me. I was in a loft department in the warehouse district of downtown Los Angeles, which was not great in the best of times. But I was coming off an experience where I was assisting an elderly painter. I was a studio manager. And part of my job was to determine where his collection of work was going to end up. He was quite elderly. He was at the end. So I made a trip to Crozier Fine Arts, and it was a 30,000 square foot warehouse, stacked floor to ceiling with painting crates. And I thought, well, this is where art goes to die. And I stopped making art for a good long time. I stopped making things, but I made some jewelry during COVID. So, well, at least I can sell this. So anyway, COVID was awful for everybody.
I love COVID. Uh,
I mean, I liked not having to leave the house, and in fact, I've adopted that. I was like, this is good. We're going to move forward with this.
I didn't like the part about people dying, but
No.
the part about no one pestering me to do something on a deadline was amazing.
Yeah.
I got real creative during COVID.
I mean, yeah, I was a little bit on strike just because I was like, well, what am I doing? But, you know, I think it opened up a lot of existential questions in people. But coming out of that experience, it became even more clear to me that, you know, art as a utility, like I said, it has to have a high vibration and a high level of ability to connect with people. Like, and I think, you know, that means creating a language that everybody can access. I think your work does that. Your work does that too.
So, since you brought this up, I was wanting to have the three of you talk about this idea of art as a utility and the pros and cons of even that way of thinking about art, the usefulness of art. You want to take that?
Sure. I think art does serve a purpose. With the invention of the camera, the purpose changed. Up until that point, it was a means of historical documentation. Once the camera was invented, art kind of exploded, and you could do whatever you wanted. So, you know, I think in that sense, the utility changed over the last 150 or 200 years. And now I think it has more of a utility for self-awareness, self-understanding, particularly if you're working in abstraction. Well, not necessarily. Narrative work can get to those places too. So I think there is actually a purpose to trying to, I don't think there's anything bad about trying to understand yourself.
Working as an adjunct professor of craft at University of the Arts, we spent about 25 years trying not to get our department deleted. And so we had to justify the idea of craft, which is based in the idea of utility. What I think is Immanuel Kant was a real pissant, because the idea of art for art's sake kind of originates with him. And I feel like has maybe a sort of hits a magical moment, and then it's just like, yeah, why don't you just sign your own death warrant to total irrelevancy? Why don't you? I don't, I agree. All art has a purpose, and it has, I think, two very different purposes. Like there's a purpose for the person looking at it and the purpose for the person making it, and they're really different from each other or kind of the same. I don't know. But they, like when I taught this creativity class, you'd ask the students, like, you know, what's your North Star? Every one of them would say that if they couldn't make art, they would go crazy. It was like the normal answer. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, but a lot of you are going to quit and you're probably not going to go crazy. So like, what's the real answer? But people who make art most of them love to make art, which is, you know, I don't know. Do I worry about AI? I worry about like if we mutate to have flippers instead of hands, or, you know, like what are we going to do with all these people who are raring to make art? Because there's a lot of them. And so it has a different purpose for the maker as it does the viewer. But if nothing else, art for art's sake was always intended to make white men feel good about themselves. No, that isn't what I meant. It's for contemplation.
I make art to regulate my nervous system.
So,
White man, can you please
yeah,
respond?
allow me to elevate my mediocrity. So I think it's interesting that you, I'm guessing, don't like Immanuel Kant, because he's actually also one of the reasons why I turned away from that you can't talk about beauty thing. His reflections on beauty got me to sort of like accept that as part of my practice as a young artist, college student. I would like to hear more about your Disney
We're gonna have a punch up at the bar later.
art fight. So I think that there was a period of time where every artist statement had something about the human experience in it, and their engagement with human experience and the human experience. And I think that it's the fact that you create something and put it into the world, and then somebody else has to have that human experience, and they get to stand at the same distance that you stood from when you made the thing. They get to stand in your shoes. They get to see it at the scale at which you saw it. They get to see the evidence of your existence, right? And I think that that connection to humanity is kind of what keeps us going in a lot of ways. I also think that that's the definition of utility in a lot of ways. Like, what is it good for well-being? Yeah, it's good for my well-being. And then potentially for a viewer who maybe applies their own narrative to my abstraction, it's maybe good for their well-being. Is it good for transcendence? Well, I've had plenty of transcendent experiences while making artwork. I've also had transcendent experiences while viewing other people's artwork, and whether or not they had a transcendent experience while making those things becomes irrelevant, because my experience with their object is what's happening in that moment. And so I think, as far as like art being a utility, it really comes down to, we're trying to compartmentalize something that I think artists have kind of always felt. It's like every time it comes up, it's like, is art good for health? Yes, art's good for health. Yeah, I could have told you that years ago, but I don't think that we ever kind of have defined it that way. And I think that that's where that intersection between science and arts, it gets interesting, because the languages are so different, and also fairly similar at times. But I think that it helps us to speak about an object or an image in that different language that actually helps us translate it to the viewer in another way.
I also think that viewers are like what you just touched on. I mean, I think my experience of creativity is that it's basically a field that I can tap into, and I'm pulling from the field that everybody else has access to, but the filter of their experience is going to change how they see it or feel about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the death of the author by Roland Barthes, right? That we bring all of our experience to everything that we, whether it's an image or a piece of literature, and that we're making meaning, and the cost of that is the author is time. Yeah,
I feel like I'm not making meaning though. Like if I had to go to my studio and make meaning, I would just crumble. That's too much.
you're making a canvas for me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's different. So I'm making, but when I'm thinking about the image that I'm making, I'm thinking things like, is this blank enough that people can read a whole bunch of stuff into it? So I don't know what that means, but I think you do. So it actually becomes very hard for me to talk about meaning in my artwork. And also, as a longtime teacher, I found that when we asked our students to talk about the meaning of their artwork before it was done, we were kind of robbing them of the chance to really explore and to change their mind about things. Like they would be like, well, all right, I'm making a project about like saving the whales. So here's a picture of a whale. And you'd be like, oh God, that's awful. Yeah, it sort of shut things down. So the relationship an artist has to meaning, I think, is a little more fluid.
So I want to probe that a little bit, because as I've mentioned in my remarks, scientists are inclined to explain, you guys. And and Pablo's mirror model has been very influential in the world of science, but I have had conversations with you and other people about this idea that somehow artists start with, like Athena in their forehead, like they've got the meaning and now they got to implement it. And, and I mean, Pablo's paper is more nuanced than that, but that's the top line. And you guys reject that as the order in which things happen.
I stopped asking my students what they were working on, and I started saying, what's your starting point? A starting point isn't the same as knowing the meaning in advance. It's a starting point. And I found that to be helpful from a pedagogical point of view. Yeah, I got more to say on this.
Yeah, I think like I don't really want to have a practice where I say, today I'm going to make the thing that's about this, and then I make it, and then I say, now I just made the thing that's about that. I think that the process of making things is supposed to peel off layers, and so the idea that we start with meaning, we might start with something that speaks to our entire body of work that we're jumping off from a previous work. But I don't think that and I would also say, potentially subconsciously there's that meaning that we're not necessarily putting words to when we start a process, because that's directing our intuition. But yeah, I mean, I would definitely push back against the idea that we're following a recipe where start with the ingredients and then do the process.
If anything, the recipe is driven by the constraints of the materials.
I would say I reject Cartesian divides of hand and mind and body. Sometimes I am working towards things just by playing with materials with my hands. So I agree with what you're both saying.
Absolutely.
So you don't like Kant, you don't like Descartes. We'll go down the list.
It's not the pineal gland. That does something else.
So
We're
we
going to
don't
start talking about that. That's kind of interesting.
we don't have a lot of time left, and so I want to give. Yeah, I know we're just starting, but the boss says we
It'll
can't.
be more interesting when we get to the bar anyway.
Yeah, so Ulana's, this will continue. But I'd like each of you just to comment on what so you guys had a specific experience in my lab, but what would you tell other artists and scientists? Like what kinds of models? I mean, Lucas, after you, we talked about how should I even pitch this kind of stuff, right? So and start with you, Jennifer, like whether it's a neuroscience lab or a physics lab or a biology lab, depending on where the adjacencies are for an artist practice, how should they think about a residency?
I would say just approach it with an open mind and say, I can always learn something new. I mean, for me personally, like I said, I'm interested in understanding unseen systems. And scientists have a way of studying unseen systems in a very precise way. And most of everything that I understand is through intuition. So I like having the data to back that up. Or at least knowing that there is data to back that up. Whether or not I look at it is another question. I mean, I think approaching a situation like that would be to just say, hey, what can I learn from this? How can this inform my inquiry? And to just, because like I think that it's completely foreign to me to be in a neuroscience lab. I don't know. So, I'm kind of like, well, I don't know. It's unexpected. Whatever, I'm open to whatever unexpected thing that's going to like spark an idea for me. Because like Judith said, a lot of times I work with my hands, but it's also in service of an idea. And my ideas generally come from other practices outside of art.
I think you said it all. I will say, I think it's a wonderful opportunity. I'm so glad that you are doing this, Anjan. My experience as a professional artist is that like most curators would rather I was dead and historical rather than like actually there with like a mouth. Uh, so you're ahead of the game there.
I had meeting before you're dead and gone. Yeah, I just want to brag on Judith a minute. So Lucas, I don't want to take away your time. Judith's project at the center ended up being written up in the New York Times. So it really was an extraordinary piece. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think what I would tell an artist or a lab about starting or participating in a residency, from the artist standpoint, we spend so much time alone in our practice. We spend a lot of time in our own heads, and then having the opportunity to be in this space where like everybody's practice revolves around this communal thought, you know. I think that that's really beneficial in helping us get out of our own head. It also provides us an opportunity to explain what we do to an audience that is not our own brain, and is not students at a university, and is not just another bunch of artists drinking beers at an opening reception, right? And so there's a way in which we get the opportunity to translate what we do. And as far as the folks, the scientists in the lab, you know, without sounding harsh, you know, if you're gonna talk about art and artists, maybe like have one around. You know, it seems to me like it would make sense to you know have someone there to be like, no, that's not actually, in my experience, it's not really the way we do things, you know. And I think that kind of check on both sides is really important, right? The artist being put in a position where they kind of like have to talk about stuff, and the scientist being like, oh, like there's one of those, it's like seeing something in the wild, like, oh, did you see that? That's an artist in the corner. You know, I think it's beneficial in those two ways.
Great. Give a round of applause for these fantastic.
Thank you so much, Anjan and Jennifer and Judith and Lucas. That was really illuminating. One of the best pieces of advice I was ever given by an artist is leave them wanting more. So we don't have time for questions. You have to come to Alana's and ask them questions at the social. But thank you all so much for being here. Once again, Outer States is playing at Ulana.